Let's just review a little bit about the male. Let's discuss these checkpoint questions. So for each of the following descriptions, indicate whether it applies to Sertoli or Leydig cells. Right, so are present in these seminiferous tubules. Which of these cells are present in the seminiferous tubule? The Sertoli cell, right? So the Sertoli cell lines the seminiferous tubule, is responsible for supporting the production of sperm, and are actually in the tubular structure itself. The Leydig cells are outside. The second description here is are present outside the seminiferous tubule, so that's the Leydig cell. The third description is secretes testosterone, that's the Leydig cell, right? The Leydig cell secretes testosterone. Are the target cells of FSH, that's the Sertoli cell. Are the target cells of LH, that's the Leydig cell. Secrete inhibin, that's the Sertoli cell, right? So we should understand what cells secrete what and which hormones are influencing the cells to secrete their substances. Number 2, arrange the following structures so that they correctly describe the path of sperm from the testis to the penis. So the first structure the sperm encounter in the testis are the seminiferous tubule, right? They're produced within the tubule, make their way through the tight junctions of Sertoli cells and into the lumen. From the lumen, they spend it 20 days there, not motile yet, developing. And then from the lumen of the seminiferous tubule, they make their way to the efferent ductules. To the rete testis, which is in the testis, then to the efferent ductule. From the efferent ductule, they make their way to the epididymis. From the epididymis to the vas deferens. From the vas deferens to the ejaculatory duct. From the ejaculatory duct, then to the urethra. Okay, and from the urethra, they are expelled outside. Okay. Question? All right, so we had seminiferous tubule, rete testis, which is sort of the core of the testis, then to the epididymis, which is sort of the outer portion of the testis, then to the vas deferens. The vas deferens makes its way all the way around the bladder to the ejaculatory duct. From the ejaculatory duct, then it opens into the urethra, and from the urethra, it makes its way outside to the penis. Okay. Number 3. Describe the role of the autonomic nervous system in male sexual response. So we talk about the 2 divisions, the parasympathetic division controlling the first phase of the male sexual response, and then the emission and ejaculation being controlled by the sympathetic division of the nervous system. All right, let's move on here. Let's talk about the female structures, the female reproduction. Here we're going to talk about ova and how they develop. We'll talk about the menstrual cycle, right? That cyclical period of 28 days where we have lots of changes, not only hormonally, but in the ovaries as well as the uterus. We'll talk about those changes. And then we'll talk about hormonal regulation in terms of the long-term regulation in female reproduction. We're not going to speak about pregnancy, right? So you can X those last 2 or 3 slides out. We will not talk about hormonal regulation through pregnancy. Okay, so the female reproduction system, the main sequence of events is controlled by the menstrual cycle. So these are cyclical changes that take place over the course of 28 days. And again, cycles can change. So this is sort of a range here. Cycles can go from 26 to 33 days, right? But typically they are 28 days long. Now this is including several different timed events. There are restricted periods of fertility, a very small window throughout this cycle, typically 1 to 5 days, 1 to 3 days, and more focused or more specifically about 24 to 48 hours. So a very small window with which fertility or fertilization is even possible successfully. And that is called ovulation. So ovulation is the period where an egg ruptures or is exocytosed from the Graafian follicle within the ovary, and it leaves the ovary and it makes its way into the fimbriae of the uterine tract, and from the fimbriae, it can travel towards the sperm. So the sperm is heading to the egg, but the egg is also heading towards the sperm, right? The egg's not gonna be lazy. It's gonna make some effort to move along the reproductive tract towards the fundus of the uterus. And we'll point out those structures as we go through. Now there's limited gamete production And so this is sort of the, where the saying that sperm are cheap and eggs are expensive comes in. So a man can make as many sperms as needed as possible, right? He makes them continuously throughout his life cycle. A woman, not so much. She's born with all the eggs she will ever have, right? So at birth, let's say she has 400 eggs, that's all the eggs that she will have for her reproductive life. Okay, so there's a limited gamete pool in the case of women or females. Right, let's talk about some of the structures for females. We have a follicle. So the follicle is the structure that contains the ovum. This is within the ovary. So the ovaries are the gonads. They're synonymous to the testes in males. And within the ovaries, we have the developing gamete, which is an ovum. And the ovum is embedded within a structure that's called a follicle. Now, the follicle goes through several phases. It starts off as a small primordial follicle, very similar to the spermatogonium. So we talked about the spermatogonium at the basement membrane and how it undergoes a transition to become a mature spermatocyte or spermatozoa. Here, the primordial follicle is like that premature, early stage of this ovum. The primordial follicle continues developing within this structure called a follicle. And then when it becomes a Graafian follicle, this is in its most mature stage. So a Graafian follicle has theca cells that are helping to support the production or the development of this ovum, but then it also has the ovum within it. And this is the most mature form of this follicle. So when the follicle becomes a Graafian follicle, it's ready for exocytosis, and that exocytosis is ovulation. When it ruptures, it lyses out of that ovary, and it is exited to be picked up by the embryo. Again, so you want to equate oocyte, which is that mature gamete within the follicle, with an ovum, right? They're the same thing. So a mature oocyte becomes an ovum, or the mature female gamete. We also have the granulosa cells. Now there's a bit of detail with regards to the theca cells versus granulosa cells. We're not going to talk about the details of differentiating those cells, but we will refer to the supporting cells of the ovum as the granulosa cells. So the granulosa cells target estrogen and FSH, similar to the way FSH targeted Sertoli cells. So the granulosa cells are also functioning like Sertoli cells. They're functioning in a supportive role. So they're helping the development of these ovum. They secrete certain chemical messengers that help with the development of the ovum. Also, like Sertoli cells, they also secrete inhibin. And we know that inhibin is going to provide a negative feedback to the FSH to stop that FSH secretion from the anterior pituitary. They transport nutrients to the oocyte through gap junctions. So they're communicating. We talked about gap junctions, like those communicating networks, those channels that can link one cell to the other, and help cells to communicate, to pass on information, so to speak. And they also secrete estrogen. So granulosa cells, the take-home point here, very similar in their function and in their location to the development of eggs, very similar to Sertoli cells, right? They secrete inhibin, they help the target cells to secrete estrogen and FSH. All right, and this table helps to further show that Sertoli cells and granulosa cells share quite a few properties. Okay, so they both secrete a fluid, right? In the case of males, that fluid helps with the mobility and the sustainability of the sperm. In the case of women, the granulosa cell secretes an antral fluid, and that fluid actually helps to gush or to push the egg out as it ovulates, as it ruptures out of that sac. They also provide support and nutrients, right? Both of them do, for the sperm and the ovum, respectively. So they're very similar in their function. Then they both secrete inhibin. All right, moving on to the process are the meiosis of meiosis in females here. So we have the oogonia, which becomes an ovum. That's the mature female gamete, but it starts as that immature, that primordial oogonia. So this is, again, a diploid cell. and it divides into two via mitosis, and then we get into meiosis. Now, the meiotic process in women is much different than it is in men. Meiosis is arrested at two stages. It's going to be arrested in meiosis 1. Okay, so when a female is born, her germ cells, her gametes are arrested at meiosis 1. And meiosis 1 only picks up and continues when puberty begins. So after puberty begins, meiosis 2 will pick up and continue, but meiosis 2 never actually completes until we have fertilization. So in males, we saw a continuous process, right? Across the Sertoli cell, we saw the cells going from the premature spermatogonium all the way out to 4 haploid daughter cells in the case of males. Now with women, we actually lose some of our additional cells. They become what we call polar bodies. And polar bodies, basically all the material sort of dissolves and dissolutes, and that eventually regresses. So basically we have one secondary oocyte after the first meiotic division. And this is prior to ovulation, right? So when a female child grows up, she becomes developed, she enters puberty, then her meiosis will pick up and it will continue. So during or prior to ovulation for her cycle, she'll pick up meiosis 1, it'll continue, but we want to remind ourselves meiosis 2 will start, but it will not be completed until fertilization. So if she does not fertilize, or if there's not a male and there's not fertilization of this ovum, this whole process just sort of squanders and dies, okay? Upon successful fertilization, meiosis 2 is complete, and we have a fertilized zygote. Alrighty, and we also want to remind ourselves here that the, okay, yeah, that's correct. All right, any questions so far? All right, we're going to move on to talk about the menstrual cycle. So this is probably the most important part of the female reproductive function. The different changes that are experienced during this 28-day cycle. Now we want to understand that this cycle is controlled by hormones. So hormones dictate what happens, when it happens, and this is why hormones is such an important part of reproductive function. Okay, if you're having reproductive troubles, you typically go and speak to an endocrinologist or someone who specializes in this sort of hormone function and hormone processes. So there are two subcycles of the menstrual cycle. There's the ovarian cycle, and then there is the uterine cycle. The ovarian cycle has two further subsets, which are the follicular phase and the luteal phase. And then the uterine cycle also has three subsets, which we'll talk about, which are the proliferative phase, the menstrual phase, and the secretory phase. All right, so two main subsets, the changes that happen at the ovaries and the changes that happen in the uterus. And within those two main cycles, we have further subdivisions. Right, and then just to bring it back and remind ourselves that estrogen and progesterone are the hormones that are controlling all of these cyclical events in women. So starting off with the ovarian cycle, the changes that take place in the ovary, there are two main phases, the follicular phase, and it's easy to associate follicular with the word follicle. And I want you to understand that during this phase, the focus is on the development of the follicle. So we have that primordial follicle, and it develops all the way through to become a Graafian follicle. Right? That's what happens in the follicular phase. Now, this is typically the first day of menstruation all the way to the first day of ovulation. So typically the first 14 days of the cycle. Okay? The luteal phase are the last 14 days of the cycle, and this is focused on the development of the luteum. We'll talk about the corpus luteum, what that is. But again, associate the word luteal with the development of the corpus luteum. So this is the last 14 days. This is from ovulation, so when you have that egg rupturing from the Graafian follicle, all the way through to the day right before menstruation. So again, just to remind ourselves, day 1 to day 14 represents the follicular phase. We have the primordial follicle. It is in various stages of development until it becomes a mature Graafian follicle. At this point, under hormonal influence, this oocyte will rupture from the follicle. Now the follicle will become a structure we call the corpus luteum. And the corpus luteum literally translates to yellow body. And as you can see, the egg leaves this follicle, what's left is sort of this structure, this CL body we call it, and it looks kind of yellow like this, and it's responsible for maintaining the production of hormones. We'll talk about the hormones that are produced. So the take-home message: the follicular phase, development of the follicle; the luteal phase, development of the corpus luteum. All right, so during the follicular phase, we have FSH and estrogen that stimulate the growth of the follicle, very similar to what we saw with the males. Okay, so a few follicles will develop from the primordial follicles, and they'll make their way all the way to become a Graafian follicle. So during each month, although we have one egg ovulating, or typically have one egg ovulating, we can't have more than one. But although we typically have one egg ovulating, there are several primordial follicles that are sort of getting themselves ready. And they're kind of seeing who will make it to the end. Okay, so they start to grow, they start to develop to become Graafian follicles. They develop a zona pellucida, and they develop an antrum. So there's a central region of fluid here that's called the antrum, and that has a very important function that we'll talk about. But this fluid-filled region is the antrum. Now, typically throughout development, as we get closer to ovulation, a dominant follicle will emerge. So it's the one follicle that's the most mature. It's sort of progressed the furthest in stages of development, and this will secrete factors, paraffin factors, that stimulate the other follicles to regress. So it's basically saying, I've made it, I'm the most developed, all of you guys can regress, and I'm the one who's going to be ruptured during ovulation. Right? And then when this mature follicle ruptures, that is ovulation. And again, that happens under the influence of hormones. So GnRH, that hormone that's stimulated or secreted from the hypothalamus, causes a surge in LH from the anterior pituitary, again, very similar to the case in males. And that LH surge triggers ovulation. And that ovulation, right, because that ovum has now ruptured from this follicle. So this is that mature Graafian follicle. This ovum has now ruptured out. What's left behind is what becomes the corpus luteum. All right, and that continues to maintain itself during the luteal phase. Now, why does it maintain itself? Just in case a woman becomes pregnant. So this is maintaining itself to help secrete the hormones that are important for sustaining the early parts of pregnancy. All right, the luteal phase. So that second phase, this is after the follicle ruptures. And this is where we have the progression or development of the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum will start to secrete the estrogens and progesterone that the follicle once secreted. It's going to pick up the job of the follicle here. Now it's going to be its most active at about day 10 of the cycle, and then it's going to realize, okay, there's not a viable pregnancy happening here, so I'm going to begin to regress, and I'm going to undergo this process called luteolysis. So again, from about day 10, it's at its most active, and then if there's no pregnancy, this corpus luteum will regress, it will decrease, the hormone secretion will stop, and then we'll have the encouragement of menstruation, right, which is the end of the luteal phase. And then we'll start the follicular phase all again. If the oocyte is fertilized, if there is viable sperm in the reproductive tract, there is fertilization, and the degeneration of the corpus luteum does not occur, because we need the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is helping to secrete the progesterone and the estrogen that's required for the development of a fetus if fertilization occurs. If not, this corpus luteum dies and the endometrium sheds off, and that is menstruation. So just to remind ourselves here, we have the ovary, we have primordial or the earliest stages of development of these follicles, and then they make their way to become well-developed follicles, which are called Graafian follicles. We have the 14-day mark, which represents the end of the follicular phase. And then we have ovulation. Ovulation is where that ruptures, so it's going to rupture right out of the ovary. And when it ruptures, it's going to be picked up by the fimbriae and introduced into the uterine tubes. Now, what's going to continue to happen with the rest of the follicle? So only the oocyte came out of the follicle. So just this part was ruptured along with the fluid. We'll talk about the function of this fluid in a bit. So the antral fluid and the oocyte are ruptured out of the follicle, but the follicle stays around and it becomes this yellow body, this corpus luteum. And through the phases of the luteal phase, this will eventually progress in its development. Beyond day 10, it will degenerate, and after it degenerates,